According to research, 12% of workers have displayed symptoms of depression. The research attributes this to the working conditions, mainly during the lockdown. Livelihoods have been affected by the lockdown, with the unemployment rate increasing to an all-time high of 32.5%. Now, to discuss the impact of lockdown on workers' mental health, we're joined by Graeme Wilkinson, who's a social investment specialist. Graeme, very good morning to you. COVID-19 has obviously affected us all in South Africa and worldwide. As we listen into some of the voices of South Africans and how they're affected by COVID-19 and not having work and not having access to work, one woman was speaking about the daily battle at finding employment, the process, the job application process in itself being something that's a huge battle. What are your thoughts around some of the impacts of the lockdown on the South African workforce?
Sure, thank you, Butch, and Paul, thank you. It's great to be with you this morning. And from one worker to another, happy Workers' Day, and happy Workers' Day to all of your viewers as well this morning. Yes, COVID-19 really has affected all of us. Not a single person has been spared. And it's, as we've just heard in that previous clip, there's also the mental effects that have happened. We've been quite astounded, I think, as society, as how this pandemic has affected us all in so many different ways, both materially and in terms of things like our mental health. I work for an organization that focuses very much on a particular sector of the economy, looking at working with non-profit organizations as partners in development. And so the research we've been doing has been very much focused on that section of the economy. And it's been very interesting to see how just the non-profit sector has been affected by COVID-19. They've had a particular burden as well, and I suppose that interface between those of us who are fortunate enough to have employment, and as we've heard just before this, there's this growing number of South Africans who are unemployed. COVID-19 put a particular burden on the non-profit organization sector because you had both a reduction in incomes coming into the sector, giving them the resources they needed to do their work, as well as an increase in the need within communities for support from the NPO sector. So we were particularly looking at that, but we believe that there's a lot to be learned from just understanding what's been happening in the non-profit sector and understanding its impact on the workforce throughout the country. And yeah, COVID-19 has, and something that we can discuss this in more detail, and the different impacts that COVID-19 has had on people who are workers, whether they're full-time or part-time. The impact has been on so many different levels. And what we found quite surprising, and yet just looking and reflecting on our own lives, I'm sure we can all agree, COVID-19 has had quite an impact on our state of mental health, on stress levels, and how we cope as society. That's just a very brief introduction. And perhaps we could unpack that a little bit more in detail.
Now, Graeme, of course, the informal working sector is probably the hardest hit at the moment, as you've also mentioned. But what's surprising, perhaps not really surprising, but maybe concerning, is the fact that the largest percentage of people hit in that sector are women. What does this do for the country, especially where gender inequality is already such a big problem, and already you're seeing households that are, female-led, if I can call it that, where it's no longer the traditional household makeup, but still we're finding that women are coming out second best in this.
Absolutely, and yes, it's particularly telling. Yes, so this is true that we are finding that as in the non-profit sector, where you've had that kind of double burden of your available resources suddenly being reduced and yet the need suddenly increasing, I think you'll find that is quite true for many women in our society, that as the unemployment rate in society increases, that means there are fewer people in households that are able to bring money home. The few that are able to bring money home are obviously there's more burden on them to carry the rest of the household, or households, perhaps in the extended family idea as well. People talk about there's a black tax and that sort of thing. But it is particularly women who are faced with that double burden, because in terms of the number of people who've lost work in South Africa during COVID-19, women have been more heavily affected. Some have pointed to the fact that schools were closed, and so increasingly a parent or a caregiver, an adult, had to be spending more time with children at home or in community, and women have taken up that role more so than men. Some research has argued, but also, yes, it has been a factor that Stats SA has shown, that the unemployment amongst women is almost 10% higher, if I'm not mistaken, from the stats I remember reading over this COVID-19 period. 10% more women were finding themselves unemployed than men. People losing their jobs over this period. So definitely, statistically, it's evident, both in terms of what we can see from the quarterly employment survey that Stats SA produces, but also from the work we've been doing in a very particular sector, with the non-profit sector, where 60 to 70% of people working in that sector are women, and we can see the very direct effects that COVID-19 has had on their mental health as well. So whether they're been able to keep their jobs, and that's been an interesting thing in the NPO sector, where we've seen this from the stats we've been privy to, that whereas a non-profit organization maybe hasn't retrenched staff, they have asked staff to take a cut in their salaries. And we can just see why, with 65 to 70% of those staff being women, we can immediately infer that women have been taking a bigger portion of the burden as they go home with a smaller salary to a household that needs more resources.
Graeme, you mentioned mental health. I mean, it's essentially been under the spotlight, and the operative word here, especially as we have this discussion this morning, what and how does one identify that they are indeed going through something that needs assistance, and what type of initiatives are out there to help those workers?
Sure, and it's such a difficult thing. I think in South Africans, we're so used to, demonstrating that we can cope, that we're on top of things, and it's very difficult to admit that you need help, least of all when it's something to do with your state of mind. It's really perhaps I'm just speaking for myself, but it appears to be a stigma around acknowledging, both to yourself and to others around you, that you are going through a tough time mentally. And when I say the mental health, it's your state of wellness, your state of, I guess, not necessarily peace, but being able to have the inner resolve and the resilience to face the things that you face with from day to day in the world. One of the things it's just a few words that we received in one of the surveys we did. It was in September last year, and so we weren't quite out of the lockdown yet, from the NPO sector. And one of the respondents said that they found that their minds became shut down. That's the way they put it, that their minds shut down, that the enormity of what they were facing just became so much that they didn't quite know what to think next. Their minds shut down. And that happens. The important thing is to know that working with others, it's possible to not only cope with this idea of your mind shutting down, or of the stress being just too much, but that there is a way to find the strength within and the strength with others to cope with the stresses that we face. And so there are resources that are available in society, and it's proving to be important that we support each other. So those that are employed, even more so, knowing that there are 32.5% of the country that are unemployed. But even supporting our colleagues who are also workers, just to be present and to know that there are resources like Chikululu. We have partnered with the South African Depression and Anxiety Group to launch a help desk, a helpline, specifically for workers of non-profit organizations. We call it Empower, the NPO Help Desk, which is specifically there to be that support. And it's a clinical service. It's people who are trained in being able to support anyone who's going through a stressful time and is battling with emotional and the challenges that come with living in a very stressful time.
Now, Graeme, we have just run out of time, but I just quickly want you to tell me, how can our viewers, if they need to get in touch with that help desk, how can they do so?
Super. The NPO Help Desk, I'm just going to, apologies, pulling it up on my screen. There are many others. I'm just mentioning the NPO Help Desk. You can send an SMS to 43010, that's 43010, or email info@npo, or empower, npowersa.org, info@empowersa.org. And of course there are others like Lifeline and Childline. There are quite a number of helplines that one can phone. Use them. Those resources are there to help.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time and sharing that insight with us. Special Investments Specialist Graeme Wilkinson speaking on Workers' Day. As we commemorate Workers' Day, some of the really important elements when it comes to coping, mental health, and highlighting some socio-economic factors affecting workers throughout the country. Still to come, thank you, Graeme, for your time. Still to come, we look at the Cape Town refugees who are not backing down. They've missed government's deadline to be reintegrated or repatriated into society. We look at that story and others in a short while. Stay tuned.